The story of America's wetlands begins with a myth born ages ago. A myth of decay and worthlessness. The chill of the wetland penetrated deeply into the minds of our ancestors, calling forth visions of the steaming black cauldron, cradle of evil, den of dark magic. The search for the truth about wetlands reveals to us their deepest secrets, secrets that touch us in ways we never dreamed. Fantasy of water birds in a desert, an illusion of life in the midst of an arid land. It is no illusion. Our journey begins in one of the most unlikely of places, for hidden in this New Mexico desert lies the winter home for countless water birds. To the north lies one of the most productive breeding grounds for waterfowl on the North American continent, and again, in a spot where many would least expect it. This time, the Windblown Prairie. The prairie's pothole region stretches from the Dakotas and western Minnesota northward into vast reaches of Canada. Mammoth chunks of glacial ice created these pothole wetlands during the last ice age. Here, just 10% of the duck nesting grounds in North America produces 50% of the ducks raised on the continent in an average year. In these potholes, sunlight and rich plant life collaborate to produce the organic material and nutrients it takes to foster this abundance of life. Productive as each wetland is, it takes thousands of acres of diverse wetlands to support North America's waterfowl. Each pair requires its own territory to prosper and raise its young, while sharing the wetland with other wildlife. It takes the full range, from field puddles which hold melted snows a few weeks in spring for early nesting, to shallow marshes lasting through July, to deep marshes and open water remaining year-round. In addition to waterfowl, over 100 species of other birds and scores of mammals depend on wetlands for their survival. Scarcely a creature alive that is not touched in some way by wetlands, and man is affected more than he knows. Many prairie farmers consider potholes a nuisance. They're difficult to work around with modern machinery, and the onslaught of urban development puts the farmer's land at a premium, raises taxes, and makes it seem even more important than ever to drain wetlands and get that acreage into production. Roughly 1/2 of the original wetlands in this region have already been drained, and the rate of destruction is increasing. In one state alone, 20,000 acres are drained each year. While this provides more cropland, other important values are slipping away. This year, over 100 million Americans will take part in some kind of activity involving wildlife. Over $20 billion will be spent for hunting and fishing alone. Much of our wildlife depends on wetlands, and yet the wildlife benefits are actually dwarfed by economic benefits. Wetlands trap pollutants and excess nutrients from farm and urban areas alike, purifying the water before it runs off into lakes and rivers or enters the groundwater supply. Research indicates that wetlands can be worth tens of thousands of dollars per acre as natural purifiers of wastewater. Some wetland reservoirs, while holding and purifying this water, also allow it time to sink into the earth to replenish groundwater supplies. In some parts of the country, the only water available comes from wells, and wetlands contribute to that local supply. Without wetlands, rainwater has little time to penetrate. The water runs off too quickly into rivers and onto the sea. Wetlands also help maintain surface moisture in the soil, and when severe drought strikes the prairie, marsh hay is often used as a last resort to feed livestock. What's more, that moisture, plus wetland vegetation, helps curb soil erosion. Ironically, one of the most compelling benefits of the wetland is its ability to lessen the impact of drought and flooding as well.
Going south, backup levee around the NSP farm.
A mystery plagues Grand Forks, North Dakota, and a costly one indeed. In just 30 years, 8 floods have devastated the city, floods that were not expected to appear more than once every 80 to 100 years.
Okay.
Square-block neighborhood in southwest Grand Forks completely flooded out. The swollen Red River had seeped underground all the way across town, boiling up in a normally mild creek, turning streets into boat channels, yards into lagoons. Here, it was the Coast Guard that brought in supplies and volunteers. No one in this neighborhood expected to even see water. No one here has flood insurance.
What caused this dramatic increase in flooding? There is reason to believe that the draining of the potholes is one of the causes. The waters of spring are running off the land more rapidly than before, water originally held in the marshes, delayed by thickets and reeds before entering the river. This crucial delay gave the river time to carry its springtime burden of water safely downstream. The potholes can spell the difference between safety and disaster.
Red River continues to climb well above the shoulders of the people who are trying to salvage a leaking dike and protect their homes. And still, it's not expected to crest until tomorrow or Monday. Kathy Dalglish, Channel 5 Eyewitness News, Grand Forks.
One by one, we have bled half our prairie potholes dry, with consequences that challenge our imagination. Officials such as Grand Forks Mayor Henry Westman are beginning to see the impact of wetland drainage.
The 1979 Red River flood resulted in damages of some $91 million in North Dakota and Minnesota. This total cost, of course, has to be borne by the taxpayer again and again as the floodwaters come. One suggestion that might be considered would be that of compensating farmers within the area to actually retain natural wetlands areas. If you were to look at the cost of compensating farmers for such activities, as opposed to the almost annual cost of flood protection and flood fighting within a city such as Grand Forks, you would realize that over the long haul, you're doing yourself a much greater service by retaining that water rather than by continually paying for flood damage.
One of the few farmers of the region who is no longer draining his wetlands is Ken Clamby of Fergus Falls, Minnesota. Not only is Ken preserving his wetlands, but he is restoring those he previously drained. Some states have recognized the need for all citizens to support wetlands through tax relief to landowners, subsidies Ken Clamby takes advantage of.
I drained a slough 12 years ago, and we have tried to raise corn, we've tried to raise grain, and we tried to raise alfalfa. And no matter how we try, this here ground is cold, it's low, and it's generally got peat soil in it. Right now, financially, I think that they can make more money out of the marshland if it was restored than what they can by producing crops on it. I plan to use these restored areas for trapping muskrats and mink, and I will be doing some hunting on there. And probably the enjoyment of just going down to these sloughs and seeing these ducks will be more beneficial than any other entertainment that I could spend a lot of money on.
Michael Bourque's French-Canadian ancestors have haunted these swamps for centuries, living off land and water, living from day to day. Snake dealers, froggers, fur trappers, and most notably, craw fishermen. Here in Louisiana's Delta region lies a rich, productive resource, thanks to the rhythm of the seasons, the ideal cycle of life. The swamp floods in late fall and remains filled through spring. During this time, the crawfish feed and grow as scores of commercial fishermen harvest them. When summer comes, the swamp waters recede to a web of meandering bayous. The females dig into the mud and lay their eggs, which hatch in late fall when the floodwaters return. For Michael Bourque, this cycle is as essential as a beating heart. And yet, with frightening speed, the swamp is drying up, robbing him of his fishing grounds and threatening a $93 million industry. The crawfish industry has grown to satisfy a thriving market, not only in the south and east, but overseas as well. And its very survival depends greatly on the Atchafalaya, one of the nation's largest remaining river swamps. The Atchafalaya River branches off from the Mississippi in central Louisiana. Originally, it was a sluggish river, full of winding bends and bordered by bottomland hardwood swamps. Changing. After the cataclysmic New Orleans flood of 1927, a massive diking and dredging effort was undertaken to divert Mississippi floodwaters down the Atchafalaya, bypassing New Orleans. Dredging the Atchafalaya Channel has accelerated the water flow, drawing away water that would normally reach the adjacent swamps. and the swampland is drying up, section by section, making possible the conversion of the rich bottomland hardwood wetlands for soybeans and other crops. Over 165,000 acres of bottomland hardwoods are cleared every year in the lower Mississippi Valley alone. And this is just one example of changes that pervade vast portions of the South. The loss of wetlands, which provide an irreplaceable habitat for fish and game, fur bearers, migrating birds, and inestimable wealth for ourselves. You might call the wetlands nature's city, the teeming center of life, and opportunities abound when nature's city meets the human city. One of the largest and most successful urban wetlands is Philadelphia's Tinicum Marsh. Though the water here is not salty, it falls and rises as the ocean tides affect the flow of the Delaware River. Tinicum's outdoor classroom transforms textbooks into reality and gives richly what textbooks cannot.
Can you see it? Can you see where we live from here, Lee?
Uh-huh. Yeah, we live all the way over there. Yeah. Cool. Don't hit it. Is it a boy or girl? Put him back in the woody. What's y'all scared of? Y'all making the thing nervous.
The urban wetland also provides an important relief valve for city dwellers, a place far richer than an ordinary park, richer to the spirit, richer to explore. The Atlantic coast harbors some of the most valuable wetlands in the world, the salt marshes that nourish the sea. These salt marshes produce about twice as much organic material per acre as a cornfield, organic material that forms nutrients which propel the chain of life, from the simplest to the more complex plants and animals, to ourselves. Massachusetts law restricts shoreline development of wetlands, and for good reason. Over half the commercially usable fish in the ocean live in coastal waters. Many use the marshes directly for spawning, as nurseries, and as feeding grounds. Others, farther out to sea, benefit from the nutrients, the most basic key to sea life, which spread far and wide from the marshes. The outgoing tides wash these nutrients over mud flats to feed another important food, the clam. Commercial clammers have been here for generations, contributing to the local economy. Amateur clammers have a style all their own. That's why the town of Eastham has set aside a separate area for recreational shell fishing, Salt Pond. Every Sunday in the summertime, hopefuls of all ages wait for the shellfish constable to signal the start of the harvest.
The mother. Something grabbed my hand. There you go, girl.
How you doing? Good, good. Good clamming today.
Terrystone is a small clam, about 2 inches you can take, and then that grows into a quahog, which is a larger clam for chowder and baked up clams, and that's a sequence of the clam.
How come you're out so deep?
Well, supposedly this is where the big ones are.
Talk about your new technique.
Just dig along, you feel something pointing upwards that has an edge, and you know that's a clam. Must be a barren spot.
You got all you need?
Just about.
Fulfill. Your technique doesn't seem to be working.
No.
What's your technique in getting them?
You dig.
Big. Dirty fingernails. I've always done it in the mud.
How come you're digging so hard?
Because they're all on the bottom.
You like working in the mud?
It's a bit dirty. It's fun.
What are you doing?
We're measuring. Make sure they all have a ring of. They've got to be 2 inches.
How you doing?
Fantastic. This is the best I've had in a long time. Even with the cigar in my mouth, I'm catching them like crazy. When you find the spot, there's usually a whole bunch there, and you stay right with them. That's another mark.
Alaska. Here lies the nation's most extensive and untouched wetland resource. These wetlands provide the habitat that 13 million waterfowl depend on for their very survival. Species of birds breed only in this part of the world. For others, it's a sanctuary when drought dries wetlands in the lower 48. Even salmon benefit from wetlands. The young of these adults will feed on nutrients from wetlands as they journey to the sea. Bears and eagles feed on the salmon, and so do we. Almost $500 million worth of salmon come from Alaskan fisheries every year. Alaska's tundra wetlands provide the range for the 2 largest caribou herds in North America. Though dominated by wetlands, this region receives so little rain that in warmer climates it would be desert-like. But here, the permafrost layer just below the surface prevents the water from seeping into the ground, leaving the top layer saturated with moisture to nourish life in the brief but productive summers. More than 2 miles beneath the permafrost lie reserves of oil, a resource we desperately need. Today, we are beginning to see that it may be possible to harvest the wealth of primeval swamps without destroying the wetlands we know. It is no longer a question of technology or the wetland. Alaska must develop in harmony with its wetland resources. Now is the time for careful choices, and that involves all of us, because we depend on all our wetlands more than we ever imagined. What would life be like without them? What would happen to our wildlife? To our water's abundance and purity? To our fishing industry? to our natural flood protection. And what would happen to the quality of our lives?